Hello everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the inaugural public lecture organized by the Population Association of Singapore, PAS. Singaporeans in recent years are witnessing very significant population changes. It became very common for us to hear that fertility rate is now half of the replacement level. Young people tend to marry late or not at all. Or sometimes we heard that almost 1 in 5 of Singaporeans are now over 65 years old. So we all know that a vibrant and sustainable population is the key to Singapore's bright future. And that's why PAS, Population Association of Singapore, is recently established as a non-profit, scientific, and professional organization committed to this kind of study. It aims to be a national platform to promote intellectual exchange and policy-relevant research on population in Singapore and Asia. Our growing membership includes demographers, sociologists, economists, public policy scholars, students, members from the government, and community leaders. Together, in PAS, we are interested in understanding and seeking solutions for population issues such as the changing family structure, birth rate, marriage, migration, aging, and health. Today is the inaugural public lecture of PAS, and our theme is Population Challenge and Policy Solution in Singapore, Views of Experts. We have invited 3 distinguished speakers here, Dr. Ann Tsao, Dr. Leong Chan-Hoong, and Dr. Poh Lin, to talk about population aging, migration, marriage, and fertility. Each of our speakers will use 20 minutes, and we will have a Q&A discussion session after their talk. Without further ado, please let me introduce our very first speaker, Dr. Ann Tsao. Dr. Tsao is the chairman and founding director of the Tsao Foundation. Born and raised in Hong Kong, Dr. Tsao is a US trained physician with a public health background, specializing in community and primary care planning and social medicine. She has extensive experience working with disadvantaged community in both the United States and in Singapore. She serves on numerous boards and committees of government and non-profit organizations in Singapore as well as internationally. For her work on aging, she received the Public Service Medal in 2000, the Public Service Star in 2004 and 2015 from the Singapore government. Just in this year, in 2020, Dr. Ann Tsao was honored as one of the Healthy Aging 50. This is a very distinguished award from the United Nations, which recognizes the global leaders for their contribution to the UN Decade of Healthy Aging project. Dr. Tsao is also the council member of PAS. Today, it's our great pleasure to have her with us and to share her experience and vision about population aging in Singapore. Now, Dr. Tsao, please.
Thank you. Thank you very much. It was very generous, a very long introduction. Thank you. I'm not an academic, but I'm a run a nonprofit. So our goal is really to work with communities on the ground, as well as looking at emerging trends, and through research, advocate with the government on policy change. And my claim to fame really is the fact that I've been doing this for 30 years, so it's been a very long time. So just because of that, I think I get some credit for it. I wasn't sure really of who's in the audience, but since it actually is about population, I thought I should talk a little bit about population, because actually the Professor Kuan said you want part reading the meet a lot about the concern about population health, population aging, so on and so forth. So the first 10 minutes, I'll talk a little bit about what it means to have older population, what it means for society, and the second half talk about what you can do as an individual for your own longevity. Okay, so this is roughly how we'll go. So this is just to define how people define population aging. usually when the population gets to be like 7%, 7% of the whole population being over 65, it's considered aging. When it reaches 14%, becomes an aged population. And you'll see later that Singapore is already like 18.5%, so we well past being an aged population. And the reason for that is actually probably all red, because people now get to live a good long life, which is very good. And of course, people are having fewer babies. And on top of it, Singapore doesn't have a lot of inward migration, so therefore you don't have young people coming to make up for it. Okay, so this is really the major reason around the world for this population aging is mostly because people are living longer and having fewer babies. I'm going to show you some bit of fancy slide, but it's just so that population. I'll show you some fancy slides, but this is a typical slide you'll see when talk about population aging, right? Population. So on the slide on the left is year 2000. And this is what's called the population pyramid. On the bottom is like young people, on the very tip is very old people. So typically in old days, the population pyramid looks like a triangle. Lots of babies, and as time went on, people died, and then on top will be very few old people. And then you see the one on the right looks like a weird shape like this because for this a period of time when people were having lots of babies. As a matter of fact, in the 1960s, Singapore KK Hospital got the world's Guinness record for having the most babies in a year. But people were having many, many babies. But then with time, people have fewer children. So you can see that the bottom is narrower, and then the bulk of the middle is when all the kids are growing older, and the very top would be just older people. And then the one next to it, 2022, this year, you see that people growing older is moving up, right? The bulk of babies born in the 50s, 60s are moving up, the baby boomers. And then eventually, because people are living longer, because the number of older people will be very high. So typically, you'll see this kind of graph when people talk about population aging. Okay, so Singapore is also one of the fastest aging. You probably heard about that, but we really is very fast. Typically on the bottom line, France took 115 years to grow from 7% to 14% older people. Singapore did it in 19 years. Okay, very, very fast, right? 2000 is 7%, by 2019 it reached already 14%. 2022 we're 18.5%. So Singapore, like many other countries in Asia, like Korea, China, Japan, a very few years to get prepared to build a pension system, your healthcare system, change mindset. We have to do it in a very compressed period of time. France had many years to build it, and Singapore and some of the Asian countries have very few years to get all ourselves organized. Okay, so we have quite a bit of challenges because we have very little time to put the systems in place. Singapore is also one of the largest, one of the few economies of largest number of older people, right? Just comes together with a large percent. And of course, Southeast Asia, people used to think that only rich countries have old people, and that's absolutely not true. Developing countries or less developed countries also growing older. So Singapore, of course, is not. Singapore is well advanced, but a lot of other countries around us, like Thailand is also still middle income, but fundamentally countries around us also growing old very quickly, including Maldives, strangely enough. Maldives is also one of the oldest, fastest old age countries around. So we are really lucky because I think Singapore is wealthy, but a lot of other countries have to deal with poverty on top of it. So this population aging affects countries in similar ways, but the resources that address the problems is different from country to country. If I'm talking too fast, just wave at me, okay? Because I have a tendency to talk very fast. Okay, all right. So now you also hear about this a lot, about the old age support ratio, the dependency ratio. Because typically the ratio means that you take the number of people who's working, defined between 16 and 64, working people, and look at the ratio of the number of people that support children up to 14 and adults over 65. People over 65 are considered dependents. Okay, and so traditionally, if you look at that, then we'll say, okay, the population is not very old, there are lots of young people working to support a child or an older person. But as the society gets very old, then of course, fewer people, working people, ratio to support older person. So for us in Singapore, in the year 2000, when our population is about 7% of 7% older people, there are 8.4 working adults to take care of the dependents, so to speak. But when it gets to be 2022, it's only about 3.3, and it's just reduce, and reduce. Okay, so as a matter of fact, when you look at this one, it's 2050. The blue bars are, the dark blue bars is 2020, and then the lighter color ones is 2050. So Singapore is by that little column on the extreme right-hand side. So by 2050, the dependency ratio is like 1.7 or something, 1.7. So if you define an older person as 65 or older, then by that 2050, only 1.7 working adults to support the dependents. So that's when countries get very crazy, right? Oh, we cannot be productive, nobody's working, not enough people to work to take care of people, and that's the narrative. But that narrative is actually a bit flawed, because that's assuming that anybody over 65 is no longer working, right? Okay, so this is just to show that the number of older people by 2030, which is 7 years from now, there'll be almost 1 million people over 65, yeah? And of course, with current life expectancy, is we can expect to live to about 80, 84, they're around that ballpark. And this is, again, meanwhile, people are having fewer babies. With all the baby bonuses and things like that, actually not much really happened. And you can look at the 1957 six birth per woman of childbearing age, and then just by 1986 it dropped to 1.4. So for the last 40 years, we've been less than replacement. Replacement means every childbearing woman should be having 2.1 kids, so they can replace the population, right? So it's not replace the population, but we've been dropped very low for a long time. So I think COVID, maybe because of COVID, bumped up a little bit, 1.2 from 1.16 birth per childbearing woman to 1.2. So it's still only a whole half the fertility that we need to just replace our population. So over time, if we don't have inward migration, the population will shrink. As a matter of fact, by 2050, 2060, some countries will start to shrink. Okay, so another thing that's concerning is that many more seniors living alone. This is a kind of a growing phenomenon. When I first moved to Singapore in 1992, 85–86% of older people live with families, in multi-generational families. Now it's only about low 70s, so it's dropped quite a lot. So the flip side is that there's older people living on their own. It doesn't mean that they're necessarily problematic, but this is a trend, yeah? Okay, so is living longer a burden or opportunity? You hear a lot about people of the silver tsunami, like, oh, like older people, it's got a big problem, blah, blah, blah. But there are a lot of myths. This is an interesting slide because it's actually there's a research, a pretty significant piece of research that was done recently by the National Academy of Medicine. Took out a global study, showed that these are definitely myths. The whole thing about like old age begins only at 65 by 65-year-old, right? Or older people can't learn. Older people are definitely poor workers, so economy will definitely shrink. Aging, definitely you get sick and become disabled when you grow old. That kind of stuff. Interesting lists, but these are all myths by research, all myths, okay? But some of them, of course, are real concerns. So living longer really can be some concern, like older people today definitely have more illnesses, more chronic diseases, and tend to have more disability. Hypertension, diabetes, and if not properly controlled, that might become a stroke, a heart attack, amputation, or kidney failure. But those are all preventable, but right now we're still experiencing those. Of course, people worry, if I live extra 20, 30 years, do I have enough to grow old on? Do I have enough money? And the government also think about that, right? There's enough sufficient social floor to support people if they don't have enough money. So that's why it's constantly getting people to work longer, save money, keep making retirement age later, so that people can continue to work for different reasons, but certainly so to make sure there's sufficient money to live for another 20, 30 years. And of course, on the flip side, people worry about the shrinking workforce, and there's all kinds of myths that older workers not being productive, you can't train them, they have negative impact on the economy. So a lot of this thinking about older workers being this and that, but generally speaking, increasing research shows that's actually not true, okay? And of course, I was just talking about family care. In the old days, we don't worry about long-term care. Families have lots of children, and if you're lucky to have an older parent that live long, well, there are plenty of people to take care of them. And if they live that long, they're probably pretty healthy in old days. But now people live long, but they don't necessarily live healthily and often have disability. The family's gone smaller. So there's old Chinese saying, there's always old Chinese saying for everything, is that when you have chronic disease, there's no filial son. Because when you have someone who lived for 10 years with disability and you have to take care of them, people get tired, you know? And so now the families are smaller, fewer children, and the parents are living long with more years of disability. So it becomes to rely only on family care is actually not realistic. You know, we have to provide some support for the family. Okay, and then of course there's some concern about whether or not that strain will cause intergenerational fracture, right? Because the strain is not just about caregiving, that's the not only reason, but certainly there's concern that that strain of family caregiving will divide families, divide the generations, okay? And of course, the real concern is social isolation and loneliness. A few years, in 2014, we did a study in a small community in Wang Po, and so shockingly, we found that 52% of people over 65 were socially isolated. And social isolation has been known to be associated with poor health and high incidence of anxiety, depression, and early death. So it's, of course, it also bad for the quality of life. So there are some concerns are legitimate. But the question is, does it necessarily come with old age? It's just because, or does it reflect the current times? The current cohort of older people, perhaps they didn't have access to good health care, perhaps they didn't have sufficient, or the family had moved away, or many of them were single. So I think there are definitely a cohort effect of what we're looking at now, and the future of older people is probably different. It's not we all jokingly say, you know, the 62 days of the 40 of yesterday, you know, kind of thing like that. Or how does it go? 60 is like the 40, the new 40 or something, or 70 is the new 50 or something. Because clearly, you know, if you think about grandparents and now, it's not the same. I was just thinking that 67 is really old. I'm 67, I'm a little bit old. But I don't think we think about like my grandparents when they were 67. My grandfather died when he was 67, because in those days, lifespan just wasn't that long. It wasn't that long ago that people's lifetime wasn't that long. So I think that definitely that's that. And it's actually, as a matter of fact, we do know based on research that biologically, people start to age later and they age slower biologically. So I think there are a lot of good news, yeah? So the good news, which is that recently there was a study by the National Academy of Medicine, which is a US institution. It was a global study. They had all the who's of scholars working on this, looking around the world. And the good news is that they found that healthy longevity is in fact achievable. And they feel that the population aging is optimistic. And no one would volunteer to die 20 years earlier, for sure. Well, the question is how to keep people healthy and functional and be able to live well, right? Live long and live well. And it's achievable, but you do have to invest in the situation today. All right, so I'm just gonna quickly say, okay, I only have a few more minutes, so I'm gonna talk faster. So anyway, what I'm gonna say is that these concerns could be addressed. So rising healthcare costs is only when people are sick. But we know that chronic diseases are lifestyle related and you can prevent hypertension. If you can't prevent hypertension, you can prevent the stroke. So as a matter of fact, you know, to assume that everyone grows old can be sick and disabled is actually a real fallacy, okay? And the financial security, of course, everyone has been involved in this, right? I think you take care of yourself in terms of savings, and of course the government has to provide enough. So Singapore is interesting because with CPF system, which is different from a lot of countries, which is like it's a pool thing, right? It's a social security that you pay into as a pool. But here it's like you're on your own. So it's your money, and so no one can contribute to it, and no one can take your money either. So, but that means that you have more burden to make sure you save enough. But on the other hand, there is a way to help you save. So I think so I think the financial planning clearly is one of the things at individual as well as a policy level. And of course, a smaller workforce is a concern, but we also know technology is also changing how we work. And work can be redesigned to cater to older workers. I think this part of it, actually, the private sector has not gone on the bandwagon as much as they should, but it's also one of those situations like in Germany and Austria, they've sort of figured it out, to redesign the job, redesign the work, and figure out how to match the staff, the worker with a job and the appropriate kind of training in between to place them in the right job. Okay, but this is part that Singapore hasn't quite figured out yet. And the caregiving thing, definitely we know that we can mobilize additional community resources and all that to support the family and so on and so forth. The social isolation is again the same thing. It's just about engaging older people, getting them out of the house, getting the neighbors and community involved. So there are really things we can do to address all these things. And in Singapore, luckily for us, a lot of these things are already, there's some policy and already programs moving in the direction with some positive results. Okay, so this is, you want to read a book that's easy to read. This one is a bit old, it's published like in 1999 or something, but it's actually written for lay people, and it's also kind of fairly easy to read. There are a lot of reports on aging, but they tend to be written for professionals, and it's a little bit difficult to read. So this one is not bad, and I think if we compare the current research, and really pretty much still in line. They basically say they want an individual level, you want to prepare for longevity to do 4 things. You avoid disease and disability, you maintain mental and physical fitness, you have to have strong social networks and relationships, and be financially prepared. Okay, so this book studied for Americans, to try to see why some older people do well and other people didn't do well. They analyzed the sort of the ingredients for successful aging, and that's the points that they came up with. Okay. All right. So, let's see. I think I have another like 4 minutes, 5 minutes, like that. Okay. So anyway, so this is about avoiding disease and disability, and like I mentioned already, as you grow older, genetics plays a much less important role than your behavior. When you're younger, I used to be a pediatrician, so definitely genetics play a very strong role in the health of a child. But as you grow older, it's your behavior that matters more. It means it's within your control, right? It's your behavior. So it's really we all know this about healthy lifestyle, how you eat, exercise, how you sleep, all those is really the healthy lifestyle, what prevents you from getting hypertension, diabetes, and all that, and preventing from giving you a negative, like a crisis, like a stroke. And of course, the regular health care, regular good primary care for early detection, pick up the problem early, fix it early. And I want to put a plug in for immunizations. When I first came here, they said shots are only for babies, which is of course not true. Now after COVID, I'm so happy because now people also understand that immunizations for adults are also important. So most of you look a bit too young for a lot of immunizations, but if you have an older parent over 60 or 65, then make sure they get annual flu. They get the pneumococcal vaccine. You probably read about the paper recently because it prevents them from getting pneumonia. Pneumonia is still called the old man's friend. You get the flu, and then because your immune system is a little weaker when you're older, you get pneumonia, you die. Okay, so prevent pneumonia is really important. And this pneumococcal vaccine is pretty effective. There are a whole lot of other vaccines too, but these 2 are important. So make sure you have a parent or grandparent, make sure they get the annual flu and they get their pneumococcal vaccine, okay? All right, I'm gonna skip this. And the good news is actually Singapore is actually getting healthier. Okay, that's a bit of a busy slide, but fundamentally we have started to live longer. So in 2019, this slide from 2019, we used to have a lifespan of, in 2019 with lifespan of 84.9, so 85 years old, and a health span of 74. Okay, so that's about 9 years where we don't live in very good health. If you compare to Switzerland, the lifespan is similar, 84 years old, and health span of 71.7, but they live 12 years in poor health. So actually Singapore over the years, to compare like 1990 and 2019, we actually have improved to some level. So health is actually, living healthier is definitely possible. And the mental fitness is important. I think we can say that, we have to have meaning and purpose and all that in lifelong learning. But I just want to tell you one program which if people come across, should do this. It's called Autobiography. The Tsao Foundation runs this program, and we train a lot of other people as well, so it's kind of around. And basically it's about a group of people coming together and reviewing what they call the branching points in their life. Usually it'd be like marriage, for maybe moving to a new country, having children. Something happened in their life, took a turn, it's never the same. And those determine how our life would turn out. So this is actually getting a bunch of older people together and discuss each of these branching points, and they write about it. And oftentimes as it tells the life story, the significant events, and reaffirms their life. A lot of older people say, I'm just a housewife. I was uneducated, I'm not literate, I'm nothing. They'll say, I'm nothing. Of course, no one's life is ever nothing. So when they go through this process, they realize they've gone through such difficult times in their life, And just by simply as a mother, if you raise decent children, it's like achievement. But they find that their life is far from being ordinary or nothing. And it's very reaffirming for a lot of older people who over time got pushed away because they're not seen as productive, okay? And so that's really important. But the key thing is not just about them reaffirming their life and their sense of self-worth, but it releases their aspirations for things they want to do. And I'll tell you this one story, I just make to have an extra minute. It really got me inspired. This was in the early 90s or late 90s, when I was fairly young in this field. And I met this wonderful gerontologist, Dr. Abiran. And he said that he created this program called Autobiography because once he was talking to the seamstress. She was in her late 70s, and she's sort of what he calls a bit of toxic personality, angry, bitter, nothing good to say about anything, just deeply unhappy and refuses to change. And he was counseling her and found it quite difficult. And I found out that she early days was a rising ballerina, a star. And she has great career possibilities. And then I guess must be the Great Depression or something happened in the US. So she had to quit her job and became a seamstress. So overall, her entire life, she was a seamstress to take care of the family. And then when she retired, she found that her life has been wasted. She was nothing but a seamstress. And she had forgotten that she wanted to be a ballerina. And when this story came out, of course it was healing, because then she remembered her aspirations and dreams that got dashed. And that's true for many of us. When we're younger, we have dreams and aspirations. Somewhere along the line got dashed, we forgot about it. But some of them still are very deep inside. And so for her, because of this conversation, because she worked with a fellow autobiographers, she then became, of all things, interestingly, the costume mistress to a ballet company. So she's a seamstress, right? She took care of the costumes, and she became the mother hand to all the ballerinas in the company, and she was totally changed her life around. So she found meaning and purpose in her life through this process of guided autobiography. It's very, very powerful. So, actually anybody can go through this, but for older people in particular, if you're looking for something for your parents or grandparents, you look for this program. It's very good. I know the foundation runs it, some of them, but the others also run it, okay? All right, I am gonna be fast. Exercise goes without saying. It's good for everything. You have to invest in one thing, makes you physically fit, reduces disability, drops your blood pressure, improves your mind. Everything good with exercise, okay? So I'm not gonna say much more because I'm really running out of time, but I think that anything from whatever age you are, definitely exercise. 10,000 steps a day, okay? All right. Social relationship also important. I think most of you might have heard about this study in Harvard that started in 1938. And it, have you heard of this study? Right? This study was interesting because it started in 1938. So this bunch of researchers at Harvard took 400 young men from Harvard, 20 years old, privileged, and then 400 young men from South Boston, which is of course a very poor neighborhood. They've been following these people since that time. They went through several generations of researchers and they're still researching them and then studying out their children, their spouses, whatever. And they've been coming with all kinds of information over the years, like don't smoke and this and that, all the things we know about because they've been studying this group of American men. But they found that the most recent, a couple of years back, they found that when we look back at all the research, the most determining factor for determining whether they're going to be healthy, happy, living a longer, healthy, and happy life is men at 55 and strong social networks and strong social relationships. More than the cholesterol or the smoking or whatever, the most important ingredient is having strong social relationships and a social network. So it's really, really important. Okay, I'm gonna stop right here. It was a big topic of people wanting work. This is one thing we haven't figured out very well in Singapore yet, is how to make work, and particularly paid work, more possible for the older worker. And by older, I mean not even old 50. When they consider old here is 50 years old, which is nowhere near old. So this is something we still kind of really have to tackle. And on that, I'm gonna wrap up. There's some resources here. For those of you who want the slides, I can probably send it to you if you want, okay? These resources are quite good for health and for learning. Matter of fact, the foundation has one program called Learning Room, which is to help people prepare for longevity. If you don't, and it comes to encourage older people, you design your future. Your future can be different depending on how you want it to be. right? Because if you don't think about it, you just kind of go wherever it's going to go. But if you think about your future and can plan accordingly, do something about it, your future can be different. Okay, so this is my last comment, and these are some resources as well. Okay, thank you very much. Sorry for running late.
Thank you, Dr. Tsao. Although this is a quite short talk, but your talk actually covered the most important themes in our field, such as how to define being old, and how can we balance family care and government-supported care system, and what will be the goal of aging, this successful aging, healthy longevity, and how can we achieve it. I believe in the Q&A session we will have more questions for you. Okay, now let me move to our second speaker, Dr. Leong Chan-Hoong. Dr. Leong Chan-Hoong is the head of policy development, evaluation, and data analytics at Kantar Public, a global policy consulting firm that specializes in the government and non-profit sectors. Before joining the Kantar Public, Dr. Leong was associate professor at Singapore University of Social Sciences and a senior research fellow and the head of the social lab at Institute of Policy Studies in National University of Singapore. Dr. Leong is a fellow and elected governing board member of the International Academy for Intercultural Research, and he currently serves as a council member for the National Integration Council in the Ministry of Culture, Community and Youth. And he is also a panel member of the Community Advisory Panel at the Ministry of National Development. We are very happy to have him today with us, and he will share with us about his insights on migration issues in Singapore. Dr. Lee.
Okay, a very good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and thank you so much for inviting me here today to share with you my take on immigration. My name is Chan-Hoong, right? I'm the head of policy development, evaluation, and data analytics at Kantar Public, and as what Chushu said, I was formerly in academia. I worked in a think tank for about 10 over years, and I'm going to share with you, how the work is actually based on my formal research and my current research, and pretty much I started my academic career in immigration. I'm a psychologist by training, but I also dabble in a lot of other work relating to migration, race relations, social cohesion, and the likes of that. Let me just say that in this particular space, we talk about immigration. It's a fail-proof subject, to get people talking. This is one of those topics that it's always, people always are opinionated. There's always an opinion about immigration, whether it's A, B, or C. But more importantly, the way I look at it, this is a topic that is very hard to put it as a standalone, because a lot of the issues that you're going to talk about in immigration tend to be overlapping. You always have a little bit of migration relating to aging, for example, relating to the fact that we are a global city-state, right? There is the economic imperatives. There is concerns about how that will impact your racial contour, right? The different races, and certainly, for Singapore as a very, very tiny city-state, there's always a constant concern about cohesion, whether people can, connect with one another in spite of the differences. So with that in mind, I think it's always important to look at, if you like, a larger picture, right? And try to understand what will be some of the interwoven elements and how, that can come together, and give you a broader, more holistic perspective. So to do that, I guess what I'm going to do today is really, to take a multi-dimensional approach. I'll first and foremost give you some of the, if you like, the hard figures, right? The numbers behind the immigration discussion, right? And I'm going to give you a little bit about the discursive discussion, right? The debate, right, around immigration, the more qualitative aspects of it. And then I'm going to take you through something that what I would think will be a useful platform, to connect, all of us together, right? So I'm going to talk about national narratives as I suppose a platform or as an approach, right, to re-look at the context of immigration. Right, so to begin, I think it's always good to, maybe I'll not use the mic, so let me know if you can hear me, right, at the back. I think it's always important to look at it, within the larger context, and the numbers, do kind of tell the difference, right? So here you are. This is the census data for the last 50 years, from the first one in 1970 to the most recent one in 2020, right? And clearly, over the last 50 years, your population would have grown organically. But if you look at the figures, you could also see that there's a big chunk of that increment happens between the 1990s and the 2000s, right? So there, what you see here is that the blue bars represents the citizen population. The orange one represents the permanent resident proportion, and the gray bar represents the non-resident component, right? So your expats, your transient workers, and all of that. So if you just look at the change over the last 50 years, you realize that a big component actually came about in the 90s, right? And definitely between the 2000s. Particularly at the 2000, for those of you most of you are not that old, right? So you may not remember what happened about 10 years ago, in the 2000s. But that was a time when, between 2006 and 2012, this is the time where you see there was a huge influx in terms of both the long-term as well as the transient migration coming into Singapore, right? And so you can see that the gray portion actually increased quite substantially during that period in the 90s and the 2000s, right? And at the same time, you also know a little bit about fertility, aging society, right? And the fact that increasingly the marriage age tends to be older and older, right? So the yellow line that you see here represents the fertility rate, right? The TFR, and no surprises, it's on the downward slide for a pretty long time, right? And that is pretty much flat, in the last 20, 30 years or so. Right, so this is if you like, some of the demographic figures that I think we need to keep in mind, right, as we talk about migration and certainly about integration. Now, if you deep dive a little bit, you look at the resident component, right? So only the citizens as well as the permanent residents, right? Now, what's interesting, for those of you who may not be familiar with Singapore, is you have a certain ratio between the different races, the Chinese, the Malays, the Indians, and the others. And over a 50-year period, you see that the ratio has pretty much maintained that ratio since since independence, right? Roughly about 3/4 of the population being Chinese, and about 13%, 40% Malay, and the rest being ethnic Indian. Now, this is actually a very interesting portrait, because if you look at the fertility across the different races, you will realize that among the Chinese, it tends to be the lower. The fertility is significantly lower than the two other races, right? So that also kind of suggests that perhaps one possible reason, that the ratio has been balanced over the last 30 or 50 years or so is because of the immigration numbers, okay? But this number is also kind of deceiving in a way, because when you look at the larger picture, right, you realize that, this set of data, this set of ratio, is only for the resident, right? And you actually have a substantial proportion of your population on this island as a non-resident, right? And that is actually a substantial part of the picture, right? Because this group, if you deep dive into the proportion, right, the profile of the non-resident group, you realize that a good number of them are actually from in the transient, considered transient workers, right? So these are the migrant workers in construction, in manufacturing, and so on. And a significant proportion of them will be of South Asian descent, right? So it's important to understand, the racial dynamics as you try to understand what those figures means in terms of the social dynamics within the population. So with that demographics, with the figures, covered all that, we can move on to a bit more of the discursive kind of subjects. And I'm going to cover, the topic about immigration. I think, like I said, most of you here, I can see, you may not remember, but when the 2013 population white paper was released in about 10 years ago, there is a lot of unhappiness, there's a lot of opinion, right, coming from the public, right? And this is certainly a very raw and emotive subject for many then, right? And a big part, if you look at the demographics, a big part of the influx actually happened between 2006 and 2011, 2012. So if you were to understand, what immigration means, I think the important way to do it is perhaps look at some of the content, right? What are some of the topics, what are some of the subjects that people talk about in mainstream media? So this is a study that I did about 10 years ago, published in 2017, and we looked at the media representation in mainstream media, right? And we're not looking at all kind of comments, but we focus on those that comes from policymakers, the political leaderships, and the relevant authorities. And this is where I found something interesting, in terms of the kind of context, that people talk about immigration, right? So here, now in psychology, there are, broadly speaking, two kinds of thematic classification, right, when it comes to the subject on migration. The first one is about economic competition, right? So competition for jobs, competition for a place in university, competition for a scholarship or a hospital bed. These are what we call realistic threats, right? Realistic competitions, right? Now, on the other hand, we also have symbolic ones where you talk about erosion of identity, maintenance of heritage, the culture, all of that. So these are the symbolic, right? So if you look at that discussion in your mainstream media over that 6-year period, what we found was, you may not be able to see, but there is a dotted line, right, realistic threat. So this is the one that runs across the 6 years, right? And this is the proportion of news article that talk about the economic competition. And interestingly, over that 6-year period, where you have a huge escalation of immigrants coming in, right, that percentage has kind of reduced, but also somewhat constant. What was interesting, however, is the proportion of symbolic threat articles, right? So these are the articles that talk about heritage, talk about identity, talk about what does it mean to be Singaporean, right? And that is the yellow dotted line, and you can see that it actually increased quite steadily until 2011. Okay, so at the very least, these are some of the topics that people talk about. Now, clearly, these are the reports in mainstream media by policymakers, by the political leadership. Right? If you have to do it now, today, the context will be different, right? So the findings will also be different, right? But the point is that, when we talk about immigration, it's inevitably that you need to look at what will be the context, what will be the subject, what is the contour of the discussion. So that was past, right, 10 years ago. So today, immigration is still a raw and emotive subject for many, right? And you really don't have to look that far. You can also see some of the discussion that surfaces in Parliament, for example. So one example will be the concern, right, about the racial balance. And every now and then, you will be able to find from various political leadership to talk about the importance, while it's important that we keep a liberal or to keep our doors open, right, for migration, to have foreign talent to come in, right, to bring in global talents from all over the world. It is also important that we want to ensure that there is a racial balance, right? And I think this is where part of that policy-making decision is also informed by what has been some of the experience for the past 50 years and certainly before that, right? So this is the, if you look at currently the population profile, right? And again, you can see that the non-resident component is a significant one. I wrote about this. So why is it that Singaporeans are so obsessed, when you talk about symbolic, right? The heritage, the national identity, what does it mean to be Singaporean? I wrote about that in an op-ed last year for CNA, and this is in response to this huge interest of the TikTok CEO. I don't know whether some of you have a TikTok account. Chiu Sozi was a Singaporean, and he was the first person to be appointed as the CEO of a global Chinese company. Right? So there was a lot of interest in whether he has served national service. Right? More than the fact that he was the CEO, he oversees this global conglomerate. So the reason why, and one of the things that I mentioned here is that the reason why Singaporeans are so obsessed with national identity is because this is a lever, a psychological lever, where you determine whether somebody is one of us or not one of us. And this gives the person a sense of control, right? Whether it's real or surreal, doesn't matter, right? Of how he control what will be a part as a member of this city-state, right? So soon after I published this one, lo and behold, the next day my inbox was flooded with both fan mails and hate mails. Thankfully, got more fan than hate, right? But at the very least, it illustrates to me that I think, you know, whenever we talk about this topic, it is still a very raw and a very emotive subject, you know, when it comes to immigration, right? Because at the heart of it, you know, there is a lot of the symbolic, symbolic ties that we have not quite untangled from the population white paper that was announced 10 years ago. So there's a lot of things that is not, if you like, we haven't closed the loop, right? And that conversation hasn't really gotten to the point that we would like, you know, to cover. All right. So I'm going to move on. So what can we do about it? So I'm going to move on, you know, to perhaps talk a little bit about national narratives and what we can potentially do, right, in forwarding this conversation of immigration and integration. Now, the photos here will not be alien to you, right? So this is a picture of the late founding Prime Minister Lee Kuan Yew tearing up on national TV when it was announced that we're going to be separated from Malaysia, we're going to be independent, right? But at the heart of this is really understanding what the national narrative is in Singapore, right? So for the benefit of those of you who may not be familiar with research on national narratives are essentially the way, it's a blueprint for the conversation, right? It is a storyboard that kind of guide people's discussion. What will be the key points? What will be the introduction, the main points, and the conclusion? And it's a way for you to construct national identity, right? To engender that sense of belongingness. And of course, a lot of it is shaped by your collective memories, right? So if you have to paint a picture of Singapore in that context, it's really about moving from third world to first, being able to overcome the odds in spite of all the limitations and constraints. So just to give a little bit more context on national narratives and why that is so important when we talk about immigration. These are just more examples of what narrative is about, right, in 3 different countries. In China, in the US, and in New Zealand. In China, if you have wrapped up, you know, in 3 sentences, what's the national narrative? Essentially, it's very simple, right? The West is trying to suppress China's ascension, and it is important that we restore our rightful place in global history, right? And to do that, the Chinese people have to respect the authority, pay respect to your family members, and do everything you need for the collective good, right? In the US, it's a little bit of the opposite, right? So they believe in the dynamics of free market, and it is important that every individual pursue what is rightfully considered yours, right? Personal autonomy, your rights, and to pursue your American dream, right? And for New Zealand, a lot of it is informed by the historical relations between the Maori and the Pakeha, right? The bicultural agreement, the Treaty of Waitangi, right? That sets the constitution, and therefore a lot of the focus in New Zealand, for example, even until today, focuses on social injustice, right? Because of the colonial past. But the important point is that national narratives in all these different contexts inform the way how people engage one another, right? What will be the discourse and what will they focus on? So if you look at Singapore, what will be the kind of narrative that we have, right? And the way to do it is to look back at your history, look at how people look at the historical context, and you can derive what will be the key narrative. And I have a few papers here at the bottom. If you're interested, you can find a bit more. Right, but essentially there are 3 things, right? Number 1, nation building. Number 2, national resilience. And number 3, conflict. Nation building is all about institutions, right? Building the best of the class global economy, building your social institutions like public housing, you have your defense, your national service. So these are the creation of institutions that you can feel proud of, right? And in doing so, the important thing is to, again, put your collective interest ahead of the individual, right? Second one is about resilience, right? So a lot of stories, a lot of the themes that you see every other day, right? It's all about being able to overcome the odds, be that public health pandemic, how we overcome SARS or COVID, as well as national security. So all of that, you know, is again about overcoming the odds, right, and being able to rise above the water. And the last point, right, conflict is something that all of us can resonate with, right, because there's so much emphasis on that racial and religious dimension, right, why it is important, to respect, right, and to be mindful, of those differences that we have, but at the same time, it's one Singapore, right? So not just racial and religious diversity, but also class, right? So these are some of the key narratives, and again, it's important to understand how that shapes the discussion on migration. The first one, nation building, is about creating institutions, sacrificing for common good. Second one is about shared experiences, right, overcoming the odds, and the third one is about tensions, compromises, and trade-offs. So, if you have to talk about immigration, chances are it's going to be on the last dimension, right? Most of the time, when you talk about migration, you don't really position that, as a part of the nation building process, right? It may be part of national resilience in the sense that, whether you're foreign or local, we have to go through this together. There's a pandemic, and we have to do our best and do what we have to do, right? But definitely within that context, it's always about the conflict. And when you position a conversation as a conflict, you already started on the wrong foot, right? So it's important that as you move forward, if you want to, if you like, curate that conversation, I think it's important that this narrative will have to be adjusted, right, at the individual level. In psychology, there's always a distinction between the intergroup versus the individual, right, or the interpersonal, right? And there are a lot of stories that actually, the discussion of the stories can always be positioned according to what would be most suitable for that context. There are a few examples here. I'm going to just use one because I'm running out of time, which is the shared challenges. So regardless of whether you're foreign or local, the truth is all of us go through the same set of challenges, right? Be that in the context of parenting, be that in the context of caregiving, be that in the context of struggle between mental health, work-life balance, and so on, right? So actually there's a lot more that we are in common than we are different. I just have one example here, which is the CEO of Kriya Shruba. He stepped forward in 2019 or 2018, when he shared about his struggle with anxiety attack. Right? So a story like this actually has a very powerful narrative because, in spite of the fact that you are so successful in your career, being a CEO, global talent, Indian, but you still suffer from the same kind of challenges that all of us do every now and then, and that really kind of help to humanize the perception of the outgroup. And this is how you break down that intergroup barrier to look at it as an individual rather as a group, as the othering, right, of what would the target person would be. Right, so these are just some of the things that I think we're mindful of when we talk about immigration, because it's going to be a subject that will be with us for a while, and it's very multidimensional. So it's important that we bear in mind what will be the context and how that shapes the way we think, right, in the conversation. Right, so with that, I end my presentation, and I look forward to hearing your feedback. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Leong. And this is very impressive because for demographers, immigration issues always involve, demographic theories about the push factors and the draw factors. But I think you are really introducing the social psychology perspective and to really educate us that how fancy this issue could be, tracing the social construction of the immigration issues, particularly introduce the narrative and historical analysis to shine light on the unique journey of Singaporeans to perceive and construct how they deal with this issue. That's very interesting. Thank you so much. I believe there's a lot of questions waiting for you. Now let us have the very last one. I would like to introduce Dr. Poh Lin. Dr. Poh Lin is assistant professor in Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy at National University of Singapore. Her research focuses on women's fertility, health, and work-life balance in the context of extremely low fertility rates in Singapore, particularly in the wake of COVID-19 pandemic. She is the principal investigator for the Singapore Time to Conception Study and the Youth Outlook on Life Opportunity Study. She serves as the secretary of our PAS, and previously she was also a population policy officer at the National Population Secretariat at the Prime Minister's office. Now is the National Population and Talent Division. She received her PhD from public policy at Duke University and got her BA in economics from Princeton University. Now let us welcome, Dr. Lin.
Good evening, everyone. I'm very aware that I'm standing between your questions for Dr. Tsao and also for Dr. Leong. So I am aware that we would like to come to that conversational stage of today's lecture. So I'll try to make it a little quick, okay? So I definitely have to say that when I came into this room thinking about immigration, thinking about aging and marriage and fertility, I actually thought that I should have the natural right to speak first, because marriage and fertility is one of the reasons why we have aging population and also why we have immigration in Singapore. But actually, after listening to my the other two speakers, I reflected that one of the reasons, the trends that we're seeing in marriage and fertility are not really just a precursor. In fact, aging and why we have population aging, including increases in healthy, in life expectancy, why we have so much more human mobility, actually stems from tumultuous, drastic upheavals that we saw in recent human history that also led to declines in fertility and marriage. So, really, I think we can take a moment to appreciate and reflect on the fact that we stand in this moment in human history. If we look at the long timeline that we come from, and how for such a long time, human history really was much more static in terms of demographics, and yet we have come to this stage where we have to ask ourselves, are we in an existential crisis or not? So I think that really is a very wonderful and strange time to be alive, and I think it's a great time to. I'm honored to have the chance to talk to you about this. So without further ado, despite my disclaimer, I'm actually talking a lot, taking a long time to get started. I'd like to just do a slightly deeper dive into the statistics than what many of us have been exposed to when we read the news. Asking the question why are we seeing these trends, and then predictably then asking what's going to happen next. So I don't know about you, but every once in a while we'll see these articles either in one of the national newspapers talking about, oh, this year we have fewer births, oh, this year we have slightly fewer marriages, slightly more marriages, and so forth. I kind of circled, I don't think it's possible for you to see actually, but I circled a year. The one on the right, the one on the extreme left is actually in 2021. The one on the extreme right is 2012, and the one on the bottom is 2017. So this is every 5 years. But in fact, on an annual basis, you would have some very gloomy sounding article from the news saying something about how fertility is still very, very low, to the point where I started to wonder, I hope there's nobody from the press here, but I started to wonder, is this really news? Or is this just public service announcement helping to spread information that this year population in statistics has been published and you should read it. But basically, we see the same story year after year. It's almost as if nothing is really happening. But what I'd like to do is to show you actually some things are happening, or you can see some interesting things when you try and dig a little bit further in there. Okay, so what is the broad story that we all know? The broad story we all know that we have seen multiple times. I think sorry, I am assuming here, but for those of us who are interested in Singapore's demography or population, I think even if you're not interested, you can hardly avoid all of the national signaling telling you that we have very low fertility, right? So the narrative of the story that we all know is that Singapore's fertility is really low. And as Dr. Tsao has mentioned, it's actually happening very rapidly. So the way that it strikes me anyway as to how swift fertility change happened is actually just to look back 20 years. Even 20 years ago, when just the MMP package came out, we were actually at 1.4. Today we are at 1.12. So how far is that from 1.4? It's about a 20% decline. That's not very little, because we're talking about 1.4, which is already the cutoff for ultra low fertility, right? Certainly this is something that we see. It's a very kind of gradual decline, like you're sleepwalking into collapse. But it's so happening in such a glacial pace almost, because you can see that the decline is kind of looks almost flat if you look at it from this angle. But nevertheless, as I promised, actually, if you look at the data, there's some interesting things happening. So what I would like to show you today is, first of all, if we look at what's happening among different age groups, okay? So this is pulled out from government statistics, and it's very complicated looking because there's so many lines. So what is the best way for me to explain this figure would be like to ignore most of it and just look at people who are aged 15 to 19. And that is the very first column, right? You can see that, okay, 19 to 15, those are teenagers, right? So we don't have a lot of people giving birth as teenagers, and that's always been the case. It's declined a little bit, but it was never high to begin with. Jump to women aged 20 to 24. And you can see that cohort after 10-year cohort after 10-year cohort. If you look at, purple lines representing people from 30 years ago, now, and then orange line from 20 years ago, green line from 10 years ago, and then now red line. You can see with each successive 10 years, boom, 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 we're going down, right? Okay, same for actually women in their late 20s, 25 to 29, every 10 years, go down, okay? Whereas if you look at the slightly older women in the early 30s, okay, they are also declining, but it's not quite the same. Actually, the number of the fertility rate among women in this age group held steady until 2000s. Then it started falling. Okay, and then finally there was a slight. If you look at the last kind of major age at which women give birth, they are late 30s. You can see that actually it's kind of been almost steady, not changing much. And then there was a slight recuperation that only just started at the turn of this decade. Previously it was just steady. Now it's starting to go up a little bit. Okay, so this is reflective of actually what is causing every year people to complain about a lower fertility. It's a collapse of people giving birth in their 20s. And then to some extent, more recently in their early 30s. And a very tiny level of recuperation. This is not typical of all populations undergoing fertility transition. In a lot of other economies, what happens is that you see collapse among women in their 20s and then pick up in their 30s. But in the case of Singapore, that didn't happen. Women in their 30s did not have more children to make up for some of the births lost because women in their 20s are not having children anymore. So we have a much less kind of a recovery or recuperation from delays in childbearing. It's not really delayed childbearing actually, it's foregone childbearing, just gone, doesn't come back. Okay, so this is something that we see. So if you look at the time trends actually, you can see that there's kind of a difference between behavior at the 20s and 30s and how that changed over decades. That's interesting. And then the slight recuperation is also very, very topical actually, because we're now looking at a lot of conversation about reproductive health, which we'll come to later maybe if there's enough time. All right, so now I'll just talk about marriage. I know I've taken out of time already. If you look at the marriage and age-specific patterns, you can see again that there was a collapse, kind of a drop in marriage among the young 20-year-old women in Singapore. Okay, since the 20s, then there was a decline among the late 20s, women in their late 20s, and recuperation since the 2000s among women in their 30s, which might actually be related to the fact that we later, the next decade, saw some recuperation among women in this age group in the fertility statistics. So just to show you that basically these two things are definitely very strongly tied together, as you know, because births all take place in the marital context, or generally almost all take place in the marital context in Singapore. Okay, so far so good. Now, this is what we all know, right? We heard this a lot of times. Sometimes we even hear the government talking about how they're aiming for a certain level of fertility. Now, this is all beside the point to some extent, because when you really think about what is the fertility rate, and I'm going to give a very quick explanation here. What is really the fertility rate? This is a demographic construct that just seeks to tell you, roughly, so the definition is the average number of live births each woman would have during her reproductive years if she was subject to the prevailing age-specific fertility rates. Now, that sounds like all gibberish and very technical, right? But what it's actually saying is actually given the formula. So you basically pretend like you're going through your whole life, but you are 20 to 24 for 5 years, and you behave exactly the same as women in 2020, okay? And then again, you live five years of life as a 25 to 29-year-old, and you behave exactly as women did in 2020. So this is basically a hypothetical cohort measure, okay? And most importantly, if you look at it, what the TFR is as a hypothetical cohort, which is just looking at how women are behaving in that specific year, is that very, very importantly, it is not weighted by population age distribution. It gives exactly 1 year of fertility, a time as being a hypothetical woman living through this hypothetical cohort, exactly 1 year to each age band. Okay, maybe that wasn't so clearly expressed. So maybe I'll just again say, if you look at it, the construct, it does not weigh by age composition, okay? Is that something that is important? Absolutely it is in our case, because I think also, as the first speaker already noted, we now have this very interesting looking age pyramid, okay? And let's just ignore the one on the left, sorry men, but just look at the one of women, because fertility rate is based on women, okay? So we just look at the part of the half of that's on the right, okay? So tell me, can you see? I don't know whether you can see, but can you tell me how many women today are 35 to 39 based on this figure? Roughly, can you see? 150,000, okay? And then we have a whole bunch also of women who are 30 to 34 years old, and then 25 to 29-year-olds. Okay, so these are the prime age childbearing groups today. Is this going to be similar in 20 years? The answer is no, because if you just look 20 years down the road, okay, 20 years down the road is going to be a much smaller cohort. The fertility rate is based on basically giving equal weight to each age group. It does not take into account that the population base that they're basing it on is collapsing. Okay. So what the statistics tell us is that fertility and marriage rates have declined among women in their 20s, We have very weak recuperation, and even if the rates were to recover, if magically tomorrow we find out what is exactly the correct policy mix, the population base has already eroded, so birth numbers are not going to pick up. Of course, this is the best start you can have to this evening, right? It's what an optimistic start. I'm really glad that Chan-Hoong has come before me to talk about immigration and how that also is actually kind of a boiling issue. All right, okay, so, all right, so why do people behave in this way? Now, how many of you think that Singapore is a good place to live? Maybe I shouldn't ask this very loaded question, but basically we live in a very developed, high-income environment, right? So it's kind of strange. Why don't we want to bring more people into this relatively high standard of living environment? So there are various theoretical models that emphasize different factors, and I see Tsao, you gave me a look there because I'm borrowing from the factors that he's identified in a grant. For example, rational choice theories tells us that it's based on benefits and costs. So naturally, we're talking about lower benefits from having children, higher costs from having children. There's also a risk aversion theory based on why people have children. What's the value of children? Is there lower insurance value of children? The children is not so important anymore because maybe they won't take care of you when you're old. Maybe there's a higher chance of fracturing. Maybe you prefer to depend on yourself. Post-materialist values theory means that talks about how people have changed in their values, right? They are more interested in self-actualization, self-expression. And then finally, very popular, I find, is that the talk about gender equity theory. So whether there is equality that is for women that is coherent in the economic sphere and the social sphere that makes it possible for women to balance work and life. Okay, so you can see that people have been talking about this, not so much using this language, which is kind of like academic, but definitely you see these news articles. They talk about, okay, so for one of them, for example, talks about how women spend more time on childcare duties than men do, right? Talking about gender equity, and then when they did a survey, and this, by the way, at IPS at Lee Kuan Yew School, that they found that financial costs is among the most top concerns for why people were not wanting children or not wanting more children. So we see these kind of ideas coming across, not really expressed as such, but bring across that concept. You also see once in a while op-eds about women talking about why they remain childless, why they would prefer to not have children, or not even get married sometimes. And that this is an article talking, it is a Bloomberg article that is just talking about how now Singaporeans have to face working longer years to afford retirement because children are no longer considered a reliable source of help financially or in other ways. Okay, so we see these kind of themes being run around actually only using, I think, a language that's more accessible. Okay, but also I think apart from these kind of general issues, which is very international, I think looking at Singapore and looking at Asia specifically, we have also, I think we all agree, very stressful jobs, very, very tiring, exhausting work culture with a high level of job insecurity. Okay, there's also a lot of actually wishful thinking about how really we can balance and have everything. Right, so we have a really stressful job, but that's fine, right? Because I can adjust my fertility years so that I can have both that high-flying career and I can also have the family that I want. Okay, so we see this in the media. So, for example, a lot of people think that assisted reproductive technology has a very high success rate for women above age 40, which is actually not true. Okay, so many people do not realize that technology cannot compensate for age-related decline, right? And then there are some also studies that I have actually been involved in looking at sexual lives of married couples and how that's related to their work life, their lifestyle, the amount of stress they have, how tired they feel. And more concretely, I think it's another IPS study also looking at whether that makes sense. And when asked, actually a lot of couples say they are having trouble having kids. So again, it's not that they don't want kids. It's not that they're not married and that they don't want kids. It's that even when they're trying to have kids, right, they're having trouble. And that's related also to some of the very hectic lifestyle that we have in Singapore. So I think that I'm really close to 20 minutes actually. Just to quote the late Minister Lee Kuan Yew when he was talking about this issue in 2013, he said, "I cannot solve this problem. I have given up. I've given up this job to the next generation of leaders." Right? Hopefully they'll find a way out. Okay. So what I see for us at going the road ahead is that there will be much more emphasis, and this has been signaled, I think, if you look at statements and you look at the policy initiatives ahead, which is more emphasis given to gender equity. That makes a lot of sense because the Singapore government tends to like to kill two birds with one stone. So this kills two birds with one stone because you're trying to fix fertility and also have high work productivity, right? Because you get women to stay in the workforce. Flexible work arrangements. I think that very importantly, there is a signal showing that there is also going to be more help given to men who need flexible work arrangements. And I think that that is actually something that they got, which is very good and important. Reproductive health. Of course, we all know that. Maybe not everybody knows, but there's quite a lot of reports talking about the unbanning of social egg freezing in Singapore, right? And I think that we're also going to see more addressing of these informational gaps that's been well documented in developed countries, including Singapore. Okay, so what's not been done? What can be done? So if I may intrude on your time, another 30 seconds. What about loosening the life script of study, then date, then marry? Everybody knows you're not supposed to date, right? When you study, because that's very, very important that you get the best possible school and then go to the best possible job. What about if you relax that a little and having a romantic relationship a normal part of life? Instead of expecting this to suddenly happen and then 1 year later you're married and then 1 year later you're a parent, right? What about helping women in their 20s overcome obstacles or stigma when they think about being married or being parents young? What about thinking about children as a future shared resource and having collective investment instead of putting all the burden on parents and making it very shameful for parents when they don't have children who are successful in schools? And what about having broader definitions of success? Not only, must all your children be college graduates and then that is counted as a success story? What about another type of definition of success where, family life also matters? Being of service to other people outside your family also matters. So you are not only giving forth to the next generation, but also in a way reaching out to others, and being a blessing to your family, blessing to the community, blessing to the world. So I think that maybe this kind of thinking about what really fertility is about can relate to even deeper questions about basically meaning of life. Anyway, I'm over time, so thank you so much, Shushu, for not buzzing me, and I look forward to talking to everybody in the Q&A.
Thank you, Poh Lin, for this wonderful presentation. I really like the first part that you do I really like the first part. You do a very concrete and a clear introduction about the basic demographic tool of TIPR and decompose it by different age group. I show the hidden fact about what's really going on to explain about decline. And also the second part about different theories and possible solutions. Okay, due to my very poor time management, I have to end our public lecture here. Please join me to thank to our three speakers for their wonderful presentation. Also, on behalf of PAS, I really appreciate your support and attendance for this event, and please keep supporting us.